DevilNeverCry.
Welcome to the next installment in a series of guides for Final Fantasy XVI. In today's video, we'll be tackling the icon Odin, how exactly his skill set works, and why many consider him to be one of the best icons that you can use. If you're interested in more guides and content for Final Fantasy XVI, then definitely subscribe, as there's plenty more on the way. Alternatively, if you're looking for a rudimentary guide to combat, then I have you covered as well with some of my previous videos. With all that said and done, let's dive right in. Odin as an icon largely supports a very aggressive playstyle towards enemies, and quite honestly is the very antithesis of Bahamut, not just in its element of darkness compared to light, but in how it works in the game. By using Odin's iconic feat, titled Arm of Darkness, by pressing the circle button, Clive is able to transform his own sword into that of Odin's, a gleaming black blade said to rend all within its path, with its key ability being the fact that it needs to feed on enemies for its edge to grow ever keener, which, to put it quite simply, just means the more you use it to attack, the stronger that it gets. And this largely revolves around the Zantetsuken system, or as most people like to call it, the Zan system, which, as you can see, is largely tracked by the bar that fills up on the left hand side with its own special UI. Clive's base moveset whenever he has Arm of Darkness enabled is largely modified and fairly limited. You have a standard 5-hit combo on the ground, with absolutely no aerial combos whatsoever. If you attempt to attack in the air, Clive will plummet straight into the ground and continue with the standard 5-hit combo that I mentioned. If you press the jump and attack button at the same time, similar to using lunge in Clive's standard moveset, Clive will streak across the battlefield to whatever enemy he's targeting, unleashing a flurry of blows along the way. And again in midair, if you press the jump and attack button, similar to that of down thrust, Clive will pirouette towards the ground, trailing an arc with his sword across the sky. The main gambit behind the Arm of Darkness is that even though its hitboxes are quite large and wide, allowing you to hit multiple enemies at the same time, it does very minimal physical damage to any enemy that you face. At the same time, it also builds no limit break whatsoever. In return, however, every time you land an attack with the Arm of Darkness or use one of Odin's iconic skills, you'll fill the Zan bar. Once you have at least one level of Zantetsuken, you're able to press and hold the melee button whilst you have Arm of Darkness activated, and upon letting go, Clive will unleash a somewhat devastating attack on the enemy depending on what level it's at, culminating in level 5, which is a move that will quite literally clear an entire screen of enemies, regardless of how far away or how close they are. And I'm not joking when I say that a level 5 Zan is almost borderline broken and incredibly overpowered. It certainly won't one-shot any bosses or mini-bosses of that, though it will take a large chunk out of their health bar, but it can clear rooms quite quickly and quite effectively. Unlike Bahamut's iconic feat, Wings of Light, which degrades whenever you don't have it active, you can save your Zan bar for whatever encounter you want. That means that if you have a particularly tricky encounter coming up, you'll be able to farm Zan from another encounter and carry it straight into the one that you want to use it in. It's also worth mentioning that this move is still highly effective in New Game Plus on Final Fantasy mode, where you're still able to clear rooms of enemies quite easily with a level 5 Zan. And so now that you generally know how the Arm of Darkness works, let's go over some of the iconic abilities that you can use, as well as how you can build Zan quite effectively using parries and dodges. First up, whenever you have Arm of Darkness active and you perform a precision dodge by dodging an enemy's attack at the last moment, you're able to press the melee button to reprise with the counter move Flash of Steel, where Clive streaks across the screen in an instant and ends up unleashing a single blow. Flash of Steel barely does any damage, but it does build up a small amount of the Zan meter. Similar to Flash of Steel, we also have the Steel counter move, which I find far more effective. When you have the Arm of Darkness enabled and you parry an enemy's attack, you'll be able to reprise with the melee button shortly after the parry with the Steel counter. Clive will flash across the screen in an instant, striking a cool pose as he does so, decimating the enemy he's just parried. And the Steel counter actually fills up a considerable amount of the Zan meter. I find it to be far more effective, so much so that I rarely ever go for a Flash of Steel and always try to go for Steel counters instead. Of course though, there is the risk versus reward aspect of it, of if you mess up that parry, you're often going to take a lot of damage, particularly on New Game Plus. It's also a lot harder to miss a steel counter, as when you parry an enemy, you'll typically be standing right next to them, whereas with the Flash of Steel, you can get a precision dodge, but if you are too far, the reprisal attack can miss. Moving on, let's finally talk about Odin's skills. The first one to cover, Gungnir. By using Gungnir, Clive essentially extends the length of the Arm of Darkness and begins twirling it around him in an incredibly stylish fashion. By repetitively pressing the button during the initial animation, you're actually able to extend the length in which Clive pirouettes and twirls Gungnir around him, increasing the overall amount of hits that it does. It's also important to note that as this is an incredibly long animation, you don't necessarily have to sit through all of it, and you can dodge out of it. And during the attack animation, if you press the jump button, Clive will actually stop the animation as he launches the enemy, leaving them defenseless if they're light enough to be launched. Gungnir is a pretty cool looking move, but ultimately it really doesn't build all that much Zan meter, particularly if you're only using it on one enemy. Your best bet is to use it in the midst of your enemies. That way you can hit multiple of them at the same time, increasing the amount of Zan that you attain. It actually has an interesting vacuum effect, where even if just the tip of the attack animation hits an enemy, it'll actually start drawing them in closer and closer to Clive the more that they get hit. Up next is the Heaven's Cloud skill, a move in which Clive streaks from enemy to enemy, hitting them with a single swift attack before moving on. Provided you hit with the initial attack, you're actually able to increase the amount of strikes that Clive does by pressing the attack button just as Clive hits an enemy with his sword. If you're locked onto a single enemy and you use Heaven's Cloud, you're actually able to pretty much mash that attack button and you'll end up getting all of the attacks out regardless. However, if you're using it on a group of enemies, you need to take into account the distance between Clive and each of the different enemies he's attacking, as the distance will vary, meaning the timing of the attacks will also vary. This move actually builds a decent amount of the Zan meter, especially if you're able to hit two enemies with one strike if they're standing next to each other close enough. But you just have to make sure that initial strike hits, otherwise it's going to be wasted. That then brings us on to the Rift Slip ability, and I've made mention of this skill before, but hands down, it has to be one of the strongest in Odin's arsenal, and to be honest, the entirety of Clive's arsenal if you know what you're doing. This ability essentially allows you to cancel the recovery animation of whatever animation Clive is currently in. Whether you're attacking, dodging, jumping, launching using magic, down thrusting, lunging, or even if you've been hit with an enemy's attack and you've been flung away, you're able to cancel out of it with Rift Slip, and if used correctly by cancelling out an animation, not only will the cooldown for the move actually decrease by 50%, but time will actually slow down slightly as well, allowing you to recover and get your bearings, or to simply set up some pretty intricate looking combos. The last skill I want to go over in Odin's moveset is titled Dancing Steel. When using this skill, Clive will actually summon a second Arm of Darkness, upon which he cuts his enemies to ribbons in a dance of death. During a successful Dancing Steel where Clive is attacking his enemies, time will actually freeze completely. If Clive is locked onto one enemy, he'll direct all of his attacks on just that one enemy. But if you're not locked on, Clive will dance from enemy to enemy, striking them down as he does. This move already builds an exceptional amount of the Zan meter, but when paired with the accessory you get for completing Odin's Chronolith Trial, you actually gain a further 25% Zan when using Dancing Steel, which can quite literally take you from no Zan whatsoever to being on the cusp of grabbing level 5. The main drawback of Dancing Steel, of course, and what balances it out, is the fact that it has an incredibly long startup animation, in which you are entirely vulnerable to whatever enemies are doing. If you start up Dancing Steel and an enemy moves out of your range and that first attack misses, then you'll end up having wasted the entire Dancing Steel move. Also, if you're in the startup animation and an enemy attacks you before you can get that initial strike out, regardless of how powerful the attack is, it will actually knock you out of the animation entirely, effectively cancelling the move and forcing you to use it again. To alleviate any frustration, I personally often use Shiva's Cold Snap to get the Precision Permafrost, which will freeze all of the enemies, allowing me to pull off a Dancing Steel without the worry of being struck or the enemy moving. And with that, we've pretty much covered everything you need to know about Odin. If you found this video helpful or enjoyed it, leave a like and consider subscribing, as there's more guides on the way. Alternatively, if you think that I've missed anything in this guide, let me know down in the comments below. With all that said and done, it has been me, DevilNeverCry. I'd like to thank all of you for watching, and as always, I'll see you all next video.